So I heard a number of things going through there consistently. A sort of a system-wide perspective, trying to move this from a project discussion of proponents, opponents, regulators around a specific project, and starting to look at this as one of the unintended consequences. If we build the bubble big enough, can we start to understand the system? But that's great, but there's a lack of data, which everyone's been pointing to, which makes it really hard to understand when a new paper or project comes out with some findings and plots a pathway. We don't understand where the data came from, so it's not transparent, so it's this black box, and it doesn't drive trust. And if I'm to believe Meredith, we have a generation to wait. If we're going to buy Gap jeans for the next 25 years, do we have to wait a generation until this might change? So I think we've talked a lot about the challenges. I'd kind of like to throw it out to the panelists to see where they see opportunities in that. You know, it's easy for us to list all the challenges around the data, around the public perception, around data versus feelings, and where can we put the thin edge of the wedge to start changing this?
I'll have a shot at it. I mean, yesterday Dave Reynolds referred to the fact that Shell had released their Sky scenario about a month ago, which I've gone through and several of you have, which looked at how we can deal with a low carbon future. I believe that what we need is a collaborative between academic institutions, industry, technology firms, and consumers that looks at what is the scenarios for transition. We don't know that. So what we simply said is that in order for the transition to occur, what Shell did with the Sky scenario, which is one of the more sophisticated and multi-level scenarios in the world, and it's global, so you have to take it with a grain of salt for specific economies relativity. But it said these things should happen, but it didn't say how these things should happen. So to my mind, this is where the interface and the ingenuity of academic leadership comes together with industry, comes together with technology, and comes together with interests of individuals, young and old. And so I believe that there is a major study here that also gets to partly, I don't like the word data, I like information. No one says I need more data except scientists and academics. I haven't heard too many consumers say that. They say we want information that they want to see in the way they want to see it, in the form they understand, which is part of the literacy question. So I do think that I would say a continental approach to this is really needed, because a lot of our energy markets are also changing that people don't particularly appreciate. Even our electricity markets are changing dramatically across borders, and technology is becoming more of a unifier and a separator. So I would make an appeal for one of the opportunities is I think public confidence is part of that scenarios for transition, but there are a bunch of other features too that go beyond confidence. But that may be one offering from Positive Energy, but then where are the other offerings on transition and scenarios? And we don't have that yet.
We build on what Vicky had to say and say that there are a ton of really exciting opportunities. I think, you know, I guess, no, we don't have a collective picture of what this looks like, but we know that we have to get to zero carbon, and within getting to zero carbon, there's infinite amount of room for creativity. And I think among the people that we work with, I mean, there's a huge amount of excitement going into that. Like, you know, at our International Student Energy Summit, there is no doom and gloom. Like, nobody is talking about being underwater in 10 years or what have you. They're talking about autonomous vehicles, the opportunity for new jobs, the opportunity for new technologies. And we do have to have regulators and other systems that are ready for that. But then I think also we have to I think that we have to really start harnessing that excitement and the opportunity to lead. And I think, you know, another hat that I wear is I work with a lot of young clean tech entrepreneurs on strategy and business development. And I can tell you that it's really, really difficult to be a young entrepreneur in Canada versus other countries because of how funding and things like that are doled out for different technologies, especially new technologies. And so I think that that's something that we have to think really critically about is, yes, we do have to be risk averse when it comes to public safety in people's lives, but we also need to create the mechanisms that allow for innovation and the people that want to move faster to really collaborate and move faster. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of conversations today about, oh, well, do you take these people's rights or those people's rights or this objective or that objective into account when you do the energy transition? And I would argue that actually you need to look at it all holistically, because we've been doing this piece by piece for a long time, so I'm told, and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. So even if we're moving a little bit slower, step by step, if we're actually taking people along with us and making people excited about their energy future, rather than moving one puzzle piece and messing up the rest of the board, I think that has a great potential.
Yeah, I might just build on that too, because I think in this conversation when we talk about a vision or a narrative or things like that, a vision is not defined by a greenhouse gas target. Vision is not defined by so many jobs created. A vision is not defined by a technology mix. A vision is ultimately defined by values. And what are the values that we see that we're trying to work for in our energy system going forward as part of this transition? And I mean, a lot of those things have been touched on in terms of the role of Indigenous communities, the prosumer aspect. There's a whole bunch of very positive stories there. I mean, we're not talking about technologies, we're talking about energy services. Nobody's talking about decreasing energy services, we're talking about potentially expanding energy services. That's the kind of story and vision we have to talk about, and it moves away from that sort of hard numbers and data kind of thing, but it's what speaks to people, and ultimately that's what we need to do, is bring people along.
Agreed. Great ideas there. So I wanted to bring this up in the last panel, particularly as we start to look at municipalities, Indigenous communities, sort of microgrids playing a greater role. I think a lot of the discussion thus far has been, well, we need to get their acceptance because they may be the blockade to get a project built. I'd like to get people's perceptions, particularly from the BC context. I look at what Vancouver's doing, Victoria's doing in terms of creating visions, their values, the 100% renewable in certain tasks, and how do they reconcile that with their impacts are felt far away from where they are. You know, Vancouver can't generate enough electricity for its own consumption, so it needs a large infrastructure project far away. So there's, as this transition goes, I think those roles might change, that communities maybe empower or create alternative challenges moving forward. So I'd be interested to get everyone's perspective on that.
I think one of the critical things is that we need to set context for any one of these ecosystem decisions. And so when a community is asked, do you want to do X or Y, you're absolutely right, you need scenarios. You also need to say, and if you do this, this is the impact and on the number of other people and communities, and this is an unintended consequence. And we're seeing some of that rolling out actually in Ontario. So because of the issue I've raised on innovation and regulation, you're getting the non-regulated distribution companies doing some of the innovative work. They're going to be making a nice profit on that, good for them. But what you're going to see is a reduced number of customers who won't actually be deciding whether they're inside or outside a regulated utility. It'll be geographically determined. And those fewer number of people are going to be paying for that old centralized system, some of which we do need and some of which we don't. And it's you know, if we think the latest moanings and groanings on an increase in price in Ontario is bothersome, wait till we figure out what's coming down the road. And we have to kind of knock people's heads together and say, we have to explain this to the ratepayers and show what the impacts are, positive and negative. It's horrendous what we're going to be facing. And you're going to have fun, Chris.
I mean, I'll tell you right now that what you know, for those of you who've heard me talk about Indigenous energy, I haven't told you what's coming. I'm not going to till we do it. Because Indigenous communities are focusing on aspects of the energy transition that go well beyond the system that they're now. And that's where the entrepreneurs that Meredith mentioned, including young Indigenous entrepreneurs, that's where communities are starting to look and seeing how they play a role in very much decoupling, as Vicky's pointing to, from the main system there. So to the question you posed, unless they see in one, the narrative of the future and the transition of the future, that it will allow them to play in that space. You will then have dislocation of those who have wealth and power, including those who have wealth and power, not only in monetary senses, but sometimes wealth and power just by having population. And they'll disconnect and say, okay, we'll be not part of this process and this regulated process we have right now. We're just going to do it ourselves. And that will create the chaotic situation that Peter Tzakian talks about in his book, 1,000 Barrels a Second, when he talks about how every energy transition for the last 400 years, in fact longer than that, has been dislocative and very, 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 very disruptive. That's the path we're on if we don't get that change. So I think if you're saying to me, like, yes, there's a lot of opportunity with municipalities or indigenous communities, some of the things I know we're pursuing commercially in projects and investments will not help the whole transition because the current regulatory policy narrative doesn't allow for space for that change. It's looking at where we've been. You know, I mean, if you've heard me say this before, I think, you know, Wayne Gretzky talk about where the puck is going, and I say, you know, where the puck are we going in terms of energy, right? So if we don't think about where that puck is going, you then will get dislocation and people disconnect, and the system will get inherently more fragmented, and that will be both disruptive to central management and systemic delivery of energy, both in terms of electricity and in terms of fuels, and will also be very disruptive for those people who may not have the wealth to cope with that.
Great comment. Allan, I'm going to put you on the spot. I think a lot of what we've talked about thus far has been heavily on the supply side, but I can't help but feel like we're only talking about one half of the debate, and I think a lot of the innovation, talking about Vicky, is really going to be on the demand side, where people can really influence change without having to vote for someone or put a person in place who's only going to be there 4 years. You can make your vote through your decisions in your household.
Am I on? Well, when Vicky was speaking about the energy efficiency activities, that does give a lot of control to the individual. That's true. And the more we see the technologies coming to provide that local control will mean significant changes for how utilities will function. The thing we have to keep in mind, though, is there are a number of services that we tend to rely on and don't tend to think about when we talk about electricity services. And those, of course, relate to reliability and, in some cases, quality of the electricity. And, you know, you can get off the grid right now, but then you're completely responsible for your own activities. In fact, if you want to get off the grid, I would suggest you do it now before the regulators figure out that they're going to charge you to leave the system after the first 5 or 10 people leave and say, holy crap, there's too many people leaving. So you want to be first. And in fact, some communities in Ontario are looking at that as well. And I've mentioned that to them in the past. If you're going to do it, you better be first or second. Because after a certain point, you're going to be charged for leaving. And one of the things that I think we don't fully appreciate is just as for electricity service, we're not paying the full price of our electricity services all at once. We're paying what I would term it as a lease payment on the capital that's been put in the ground, based on a commitment that we as a society, through our regulator, has made with the utilities. So there's a lot of money in the ground that we have to keep in mind that needs to get paid for, because there's a commitment towards that. So I think when it comes to the individual, they can have a lot of choices, and you know, if you can really centralize it to your own backyard, then you don't really have to trust anyone. You can switch off, cut out, and be on your own. It's going to be more expensive. I think actually we can do anything we want. It's just going to be how much you're willing to pay for it. All the technologies are there, on the supply side, on the demand side. If you want, there's even technologies there to to build a small modular reactor in your garage. Maybe the authorities have something to say about that, but you can do it because the technologies are there. And one of the things when we talk about a lot of what we've talked about over the last day and a half, we don't tend to dwell on how much things are going to cost and who's going to pay for it. And really, when it comes down to what choices we are going to make, we have to think about that every time we make a suggestion about where we're going, what our vision is going to be, and who's going to make those decisions, because someone's going to have to pay for it.
Yeah, just when we talk about the transition, I mean, here we've spent a lot of time where we've sort of used the example of pipelines and you know, how does it fit in and stuff like this. Frankly, the transition is already well underway in electricity. I mean, it's going, and we're desperately playing catch up already. I mean, from a model where you sort of projected out 20 years into the future and electricity demand was going to grow and you'd build big plants to meet that demand, now we're in a world where electricity demand is flat or falling. In part because of structural change, in part because of efficiency. You've got a complete overhaul of the sources that are feeding into the grid, which is forcing regulators and market operators and system operators to figure out how do we maintain reliability and all the rest in that. And you've got this whole new wave coming from the distributed generation side that's coming forward. And so, I mean, one thing I think that is interesting, I think, in this discussion from what I've seen in positive energy is that the electricity sector is where this is already happening, and I think there's actually been less focus on the electricity sector within the work of positive energy, and I think that's where a lot of the immediate challenges are going to come home to roost. So I think that might be something to think of going forward.
I just want to pick up on that. And when I mentioned before about looking at it from a systems point of view, it's not just the electricity system or the oil to gasoline system or the natural gas to home heating system. It's all of those together because they do work in tandem. So if you're moving into electrification of vehicles, that has an impact on your availability, on your demand for oil. And then your demand for oil has an impact on the amount of material feedstock is available for the petrochemical industry, which goes back into what you can do in terms of the consumer plastics that you may need for other things. And the same can be said for natural gas and its use in material feedstocks and industry and for home heating. So when we look at all these things, we have to not just look at we're trying to fix the electricity system. It's our energy system, and it's all supply and all demand, and it's like a pebble in the water. Wherever you want to rest your issue, that's the center point. But that keeps drifting out from the center and impacting everything to the point where you start impacting the way we live. So, for example, in terms of energy efficiency, it's much more efficient if we live in small apartments than it is in single-family dwellings. If we really want to save a lot of energy, we should pass a law that says no more single-family dwellings. How far are we going to get with that? I don't think I'll get elected saying that, but single-family dwellings is a huge drain in terms of the resources that we face. See, this is thinking outside the box. This is thinking about what are the different options. And this is going to the point that this system is not just an energy system. It's the way we live. It's the way we govern ourselves. Every time we make a decision, we affect a whole bunch of different things.
That's absolutely true. The thing is that we talked about it being an ecosystem. We will see a shift in values, whether we choose them or whether they are put upon us, because we are facing real constraints. But if we look at those in ways that are positive, then I think that carrots usually work better than sticks. So I like to sort of look at it in that way. But I agree with you that it's, you don't just do one thing and then another. But we live in a country that has been its economy is based on straight commodities. We therefore see an economy that's highly volatile. And I think one of the things that we need to do in general, not just about energy, is move up the value chain. So, because if we then take some of these resources and use them in different ways, as you had mentioned, Allan, with different kinds of feedstocks, different kinds of plastic, different kinds of textiles, different kinds of fuels, that will enable us to take what is a highly educated country and turn those skills towards things that add value, that will add value beyond our shores, and add value internally as well. So I do think we need to move up the value chain entirely, and energy is just a part of that story.